Hi, my name is Matt Comi. I'm a postdoc fellow at the National Farm Medicine Center, and I'm going to be presenting Bottlenecks Tourists and a DIY Attitude today. It draws on some recent ongoing research I'm doing with hop growers, and I'm going to share, in addition to my current research, a little bit about how I came to this research problem as someone who's new to agricultural health and safety, coming more from environmental sociology, rural social, and STS. I bring a different perspective, and I look forward to sharing a little about that and the trajectory of my current research. So just a roadmap, I'll share some background about this project, my methods, some preliminary findings, and some conclusions that are really more directions forward for the research. Before I go any further, I want to say that the research was conducted in the Yakima Valleys with farms that operate on the sovereign land of the Yakima Nation, and that funding was provided by the Frank and Betty Keller Trusts, which is provided through the Marshfield Clinical Research Institute, where I'm currently employed. So all of my research really centers around this very simple question: how does change in agriculture? And as someone who comes to this question from environmental sociology, it was really about the intersection of technology, society, and environment. And environmental sociology really has two prevailing theories for how to talk about how these three forces come together. And they're very big picture theories. On the one hand, there are eco-modernists, folks that talk about market environmentalism, or what we might gloss as green capitalism. And this is the idea that emissions, or local environmental impacts, are going to decouple from the growth imperative because of technological innovation, because of capitalist pressure, and because of the reality of planetary boundaries, right? There'll just be a need to innovate our way out, and it will happen. And this has a lot of cachet in European environmental sociology, and maybe there's that hopeful tinge from those sort of liberalist European nations. And in the US, there's maybe a less hopeful trend in environmental sociology, what we might call eco-Marxism, what gets glossed often as the treadmill of production. And this is the idea that capitalism or neoliberalism, these dominant world regimes, are really going to stay tightly coupled to emissions. So the growth imperative and the reality that we're running up against planetary boundaries are going to remain tightly coupled, and there'll be disastrous results. These may be helpful when thinking about large-scale policy considerations or how environment and tech work when we're talking about national or transnational relationships. But when I was working with farmers, and in this case, corn and soy growers, it wasn't really that helpful for me. So I turned to a strand of research from Science, Technology, and Society, or Science and Technology Studies, or STS, called assemblage or relational thinking, that took a much more immediate horizontal approach instead of a top-down hierarchical approach. And this has some cachet in rural sociology. There's some folks that do similar research to me that were starting to deploy this strand of thinking, and I thought this would be a helpful at how agricultural change was happening. And so at the time, I was looking at corn and soy growers and how they're locked into the technological practices they use. And in this case, I was really looking at precision ag. And what this approach helped me identify was that corn and soy growers weren't just locked in because of onerous controls from maybe like a top 10 agro-pharmaceutical company, right, who's innovating these new implements, folks like John Deere or Asgard DeKalb, but rather they were locked into those practices because of the distribution of actors, right? Because precision ag introduced so many new actors into the decision-making complex, into the relationships materially on the farm, it meant that one actor, a human farmer, didn't have that much power. And so seeing it from this assemblage approach helped me identify that and push forward that literature on how farmers are locked in and what that means for farmer autonomy. Helped me answer was what farmers might do if they had a little more freedom, a little more agency. And so I was wondering, if farmers were directing things like precision ag or innovating these new implements or new genetics, what would they do? First led me to hop growers, which are the subject of this study. So in my previous study, I looked at hop growers for three reasons. One is that they're unusually vertically integrated. That's the most important reason. These hop growers have a hand in the marketing of the hops they grow, but they also have ownership stakes oftentimes in the breeding companies and will even direct those breeding companies. Not to mention the fact that they are also growing these hops. So they have a lot of control over the value chain. Hop growers vary widely in size. And so you can talk about big ag and small ag, and they're really understudied in the last 100 years. There hasn't been much qualitative work with hop growers, so we don't know that much from a social scientific standpoint about what's happening materially on these farms. And so this sort of triple threat made hop growing really interesting. And so for my previous work, my dissertation project, I talked to hop growers, and I was really looking at what the farmer-directed innovation meant for the well-being of rural communities. And I'm going to share a brief overview of the findings as a kind of framing starting place for this project that returns to hop farms, but instead looking at how these farmer practices impact farm worker health and safety. So first off, farmer-directed innovation in the case of hop grower, I found it to directly improve financial sustainability and to indirectly improve environmental adaptive capacity. I'll give an example. Hop growers ran their own breeding programs. Those are environmentally embedded. Those ended up creating a big profitable outcomes for them. So great, improving that financial sustainability. But it also meant there was a 10-year locally embedded cycle for breeding, which meant as the climate gets warmer, as the climate dries out in Yakima, they're producing varieties that are more drought tolerant, more heat tolerant, and require lower chemical loads, just by the reality that they're doing it there in a place with farmer beneficial outcomes in mind. Conversely, though, they do want to protect the profits they have from this vertically integrated process. And so hop growers tended to pursue anti-competitive protections that limited the uptake in other areas, maybe outside of Yakima or with smaller farmers. And that meant that the improvements in farmer agency were really linked to being vertically integrated, not just to having, because without vertical integration, there wasn't access. And then smaller farmers, they left out of this picture of vertically integrated, ecologically embedded breeding practices, sort of had to figure out how to make do in this really dynamically changing marketplace. And so they improvised or tinkered with inputs to adapt to dynamic environmental and economic changes in the marketplace. A little overview of what I have been doing. If you'd be interested, I'd be happy to point folks to research that I've done in this area that recently came out in Journal of Rural Studies or in GeoForum. But having sort of come to the end of this project, I was really left with this question: what does it mean for farm workers? What does forces that were at play in hops growing, like the real lived impacts of climate change in the West Coast, the increased rates of mechanization and automation, the fast-changing marketplace, and therefore fast-changing practices of this labor-intensive product, what does all of those things have to do with farm work? And how does it change farm work? And what lessons are there from this sort of forward-looking, really progressive industry for other kinds of plant and animal agriculture that's labor-intensive? This is the project that I pitched starting out as a fellow at the National Farm Medicine Center, and I've been working on for the last 6 or 7 months. So this project is mixed qualitative methods. It's an iterative project, and it started with some field work down in Yakima and Klickitat counties in that L-shaped valley. You can see it sort of within that superimposed area of green. It's a high desert that's fed from meltwater off the mountains to the west. And it's a really developed, vibrant, diverse ecological region where they grow everything from fruits to corn. They have cattle operations and a whole bunch of hop. It's the world's biggest single hop growing region. For this study, I began with participant observation, primarily really observation on 4 key farms, and that's being followed up now with an interview battery with farmers that I'm getting started with right now, and then in the spring with probably in-person interviews with farm workers, often on those same operations so that we can collate deeply within operations between farm operators and farm owners with farm workers to really look at how decisions made throughout the value chain are impacting farm worker health and well-being in this. And so just to highlight what I'm going to be sharing today is really key takeaways just from that initial set of observations. And so I don't want to misconstrue what I'm sharing as like final findings. It is situated in a history of having done quite a few interviews with hop growers and quite a bit of experience with hop growers and quite a bit of literature knowledge. So there is a little bit more to it than just some, initial thoughts. But I do want to highlight that these health and safety outcomes that I'm going to be discussing today, they need further verification. And that's going to be a key part of what I'm doing over the next. And so I'm going to get started with my findings, and I'm going to get started with my findings by sharing this figure that highlights how quickly changing the hops marketplace is. Hops are divided into two kinds of hop material, alpha hops and aroma hops. Let's say alpha hops are like basic commodities, right? You need them for the alpha acid, which is a bittering agent and an antiseptic. Every beer has this. It's not a high value good. And that was most of hops all the way until 2004. But around 2004, growers in Yakima realized that aroma hops, which made up a small portion of their portfolio, could be sold for high value to craft brewers who needed a lot of aroma hops despite their smaller market segment to make craft beer like IPAs and those kinds of hop forward beers that are popular now. They innovated in anticipation of this, breeding new varieties, selling brewers on these new varieties, and replanting huge swaths of this perennial vine plant. About 10 years is what each vine lasts, and 3 years to get into production, planting new acreage and replanting old acreage to grow these high value hops in huge quantities. So you can see that the number of hop growing acres in Yakima between 2004 and 2020 has over doubled. And during that time, the average price per pound of hops has over tripled. And so these growers aren't all made in the shade, but they have found a really profitable thing that has allowed them to scale really quickly. And so it's an interesting case study of farm work in a dynamically changing, quickly growing marketplace that centers around craft, around that quality turn, which is a little different than many others. And so I'm going to highlight my key observations from harvest. Harvest is the busiest time on these farms. Most of these farms employ around 20 to 50 year-round employees and anywhere from 150 to 350 seasonal employees over harvest. Harvest lasts around 1 month and usually involves cutting, harvesting, kilning, and curing and baling all on site in a process that runs 24 hours a day for about that 40-day picking window. Cutting happens in field. They cut the top of the vine and the bottom of the vine, load it into a truck, take it to this big Rube Goldberg looking machine called a harvester. That harvester strips all the arms and leaves and everything off the hops and sort of sorts the hop cone while trying to maintain that integrity. Then those hops are dried in that kiln, cured on a curing floor, and ultimately baled into these really large 200 plus pound bales and shipped off to the merchant company, which happens to also be farmer owned in Yakima, where they are pelletized and sold to brewers. So I'm going to highlight the 4 farms I'm going to draw some of these key findings from, and then I'm going to move on to those key takeaways. So I picked these farms because these farms are archetypal of the farms that are operating in the Yakima Valley. The Yakima Valley, again, is the largest single hop growing region in the world, but only about 40 farms are really involved in that largest growing region. And that's because they're unusually large plantation style farms. Farm A is this vertically integrated, multi-generational farm. They're a progressive farming operation that are leaders in putting new varietals to the market. We can think of Farm A in terms of early adopters as this ideal case scenario. They want to reinvest in the nicest, newest equipment. Farm B is this large, multi-generational operation, really a leader and well-respected member of the hop growing community, big ownership stake in a merchant company, and they're very brewer focused. I don't want to characterize them as unprogressive, by comparison to Farm A, but I do want to characterize them as being more publicly oriented. They bring a lot of brewers onto the farm at harvest to see this happening and to sell them on these new varieties or existing varieties or lots from their farm. Farm C is sort of the new operation that I looked at. These other two were from, multi-generational families that can trace back all the way to the beginning of hops growing in Yakima and maybe even to hops growing in other regions. Farm C is a new operation. They've got some ownership stakes from more old hop families, but the operator and one of the co-owners is brand new, except for their history in terms of like professional agronomy. And they've been operating for about 6 years. Farm A and B are well north of 1,000, closing in on 2,000 acres. Farm C is more like 600 acres. And the last farm, Farm D, is ran by the same family as Farm B, but it's a production only, not public place. And so, it gives a little different picture. Between these 4 farms, we get a little picture of what's happening as a baseline to generate a more developed interview schedule for work with farmers and with farm workers to identify what's impacting health and safety on these labor-intensive operations. So what are the 3 key takeaways that I'm going to share today? The first key takeaway is the tension between reinvestment in safety and efficiency versus authenticity. So Farm A and Farm B, they both have some money that they're reinvesting on their farm. They're building out new things. They're building out, in the case of Farm B, some brand new stuff on their second farm, Farm D, as well as a recently rebuilt new kiln on their Farm B. Farm A has built out a new harvester that's actually not depicted here, that's smaller for test varieties. They're also expanding acreage in both cases, so they have some capital to reinvest. And how they choose to reinvest it is really quite interesting. So these are both harvesters. And what I want to highlight is that Farm A's harvester, which is less publicly facing, is a really kind of ideal type big industrial harvester. It's really well designed from a visibility standpoint. You can see in the middle picture of Farm A that there's a central spot with some control panels between the 2 front ends where they load up hops. You can see basically every part of the picker from that spot where an operator sits and manages emergency shutoffs and ensures that there's safety and cleanliness throughout the operation. They don't have to walk around to be able to view all that. It's really pretty dust-free, lots of ventilation, really clean, clear safety from the evenly spaced walkways to the management of moving parts. Conversely, Farm B is in this 100-year-old sort of barn that was not meant necessarily for a picker of this scale originally. It's been rebuilt multiple times. They bragged that it was over 60% recycled parts. Much of it's made of wood with these sort of narrow or non-standard width walkways. It's a really dusty, not as well ventilated space. It's loud. Even though I was there just doing observations, not even working, I kept finding myself bumping into things and almost hurting myself while in this space. And the funny thing was that Farm B's picker was the picker they took brewers through. And the reason, as best I could tell, when they would pitch it to me on the first walkthrough, was that it was a call towards authenticity. They walk brewers through this and talk about how their grandfather first built this picker and how their uncle was involved in retrofitting the picker and that it's 60% recycled parts. And in this case, authenticity and safety and efficiency seem to be in tension with one another. I don't think that's always the case in every industry or all throughout hops, but in this case, there was an interesting tension there that I think needs to be unpacked further, especially as it impacts the people who work on these farms versus just the people who manage these farms. A second key takeaway is that as automation took over some of the tasks on the farm, which doesn't eliminate labor, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, the reality that unskilled labor is kind of a myth became more apparent to the farm. And so this meant that conceptually, farmers were moving towards hourly labor, which is better for the health and safety of farm workers. And we really know this is better for the well-being of farm workers from the policy and social research around farm work quality of life. Hourly pay is a really great move for the industry to be making from that standpoint. And depicted here are 2 piecework but moving away from piecework jobs. In the one case, working on a baler on the right is no longer really an hourly or piece rate job because it's really controlled by the automation of the baler. So there might be bonuses, but for the most part, that's moved hourly. And twining has increasingly moved towards being hourly because it simplifies the bookkeeping, and quality twining has been shown to improve yields. And so again, automating some of these tasks that were previously done by people has highlighted that the tasks that remain to be done by people benefit from better quality of work, and you can encourage better quality of work by paying someone by the hour instead of by the piece. And then the last takeaway is that automation happened in the system, and so even as you automate some of these worst tasks, what happened was other worst tasks were made. And so I'm going to highlight Farm B, which has a different kind of front end on their picker than Farm C. And so in the case of Farm B, what you see is the picker doesn't take a lot of people. It's a person in a tractor loading a whole bunch of hops into this front end that gets chopped up and happens with only about 2 or 3 people working. It's not very laborious. But what happens is that is so efficient that a lineup of hop trucks in the field makes the cutting much more laborious. It's faster paced, fewer organic breaks, it's hot, it becomes the worst task. Farm C doesn't have that newer, fancier picker. And so out in the fields, tasks moved at a more reasonable pace, organic breaks were more frequent, and workers would often have time to sit in the shade or recover or get water. Conversely, you see this lineup of trucks in Farm C at the picker, and that's because they use a more old school Dawnhauer picker, which means they string up the whole vine onto a hook, and then it runs up this sort of ladder and then gets fed in through the harvesting apparatus. That's done loaded out of the back end of a truck. It's really fast paced, it's hard on your body, it's high contact, it's a dusty, loud environment, it's repetitive, and you do it all day for your whole shift, 8 to 12 hours depending on the farm. It's a worst task. And so automating away that worst task didn't solve the worst task problem, it simply relocated it. And this dynamic merits further unpacking it within this industry and between industry. So what's next? What's next is looking at a comparison between plant and animal agriculture, specifically comparing the hops industry to those dairies that are deploying or experimenting with automation. So why compare hops with dairy? Dairy operations are labor intensive and year round and facing like pressures to grow and automate. Dairy farmers also vary widely in size, which means we have great quality for cross-industry comparisons of scale pressures. And lastly, MCRI has great dairy networks, which uniquely enables us to get connected right away with dairy farmers and start asking these questions about well-being, health, and safety for them. I've done harvest observation with these hop farms, and I'm starting the interview battery with hop growers, and we'll be moving sort of at the same time as I'm doing interview batteries with hop farm workers into farm observations with Wisconsin dairies and interviews with dairy farm workers. A quick highlight of where this stuff is ending up. A few lit review pieces at Journal of Agromedicine and at iJERF are either out or in preparation, and then a preliminary piece that draws on my previous data along with my current research and research from a colleague at University of Arizona looks at some of the impacts and politics around what it means to employ labor on hops farm and what it means for the label of family farm. I would like to say thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. My email's down there below. And again, I'd love input, questions, or feedback, especially at this stage in the project where we're starting doing the data collection, but we're still at that preliminary stage in terms of analysis and lots of time to think about the project critically and find new generative avenues forward. Again, I want to say thank you.